There are stories from history that people remember not for the darkness at their center, but for the impact on real lives, for the strength of survivors, and for the lessons those stories leave behind. The life of Ted Bundy is one such story, a story that, when told gently and truthfully, is not about the notoriety of one person, but about the communities changed, the importance of vigilance, and the reminder that kindness and remembrance are always more powerful than fear. If you appreciate this calm, respectful way of revisiting the past, focusing on empathy, facts, and healing, rather than on sensationalism, feel free to become part of this thoughtful community. Share your reflections if you wish, or simply listen along as we move through this story with respect for those who lived it. Every story told with care helps us understand, heal, and connect just a little more. Bundy's story begins, as so many do, with a childhood that seemed on the surface quite ordinary. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was a young woman facing the complicated realities of single motherhood in mid-century America. For Ted's first years, he lived with his grandparents, believing, for a time, that his mother was his sister and that his grandparents were his parents, a common arrangement in families coping with social stigma, but one that could quietly shape a child's sense of belonging and self. Eventually, Ted and his mother left Vermont for Washington State, seeking a new beginning. In Tacoma, Louise married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook who adopted Ted and gave him his new last name. Family memories from this era, pieced together later, paint a mixed portrait. On one hand, there were the same routines found in any family: school drop-offs, birthday cakes, chores. On the other, there were early, subtle signs that Ted never quite fit in. He was intelligent and polite, but struggled with feelings of alienation. His relationship with his stepfather was polite, but distant, and though he grew up surrounded by siblings, he often seemed set apart by his own inner world. As a child and young adolescent, Bundy's life was in many ways typical. He joined the Boy Scouts, attended church, and played with other kids in his Tacoma neighborhood. Yet teachers and family sometimes noticed a certain shyness, a wariness in his manner, and a difficulty making close friends. Ted was bright and observant, qualities that earned him good grades and the approval of many adults, but he was also secretive and at times deeply insecure. Years later, classmates would remember him as someone who was friendly, but who sometimes seemed to be acting a part rather than living it. In high school, Ted's academic performance fluctuated. He could be a strong student when he cared about a subject, but at times he seemed to drift, distracted, and withdrawn. His social life was similar, some friends, some dates, but always an air of detachment, as if he were always observing, never quite participating. These years were not marked by violence, but by a growing sense of isolation and a subtle disconnect from others, even as he outwardly fulfilled the expectations of family and society. After graduation, Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, then transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle. It was here that he began to come into his own, at least on the surface. He majored in psychology, and for a time seemed to thrive, earning good grades and developing a network of friends and mentors. During this period, Bundy began his first serious relationship with a young woman from a well-to-do family. Their relationship, while happy at first, ended after a couple of years, an event that, by some later accounts, left Ted feeling rejected and humiliated. The breakup marked a turning point in his young adulthood, fueling a drive to prove himself and to earn the approval and admiration he felt he had lost. Bundy's ambition was evident to those who knew him. He became involved in politics, working as a volunteer on campaigns, including the re-election of Washington's governor, Dan Evans. Colleagues and supervisors were impressed by his intelligence and charm. He seemed to have a gift for making people trust him, for presenting the best version of himself to the world. He even worked at a suicide prevention hotline, where coworkers remembered him as attentive, calm, and helpful, a young man who, on the surface, seemed destined for a life of achievement. But behind this mask of normalcy, Bundy's inner struggles deepened. The years that followed saw him drift between goals and identities: law student, political volunteer, boyfriend, friend. There were moments of real promise, letters of recommendation from respected professors, new friendships and relationships, acceptance into law school. Yet there was always an undercurrent of restlessness, a sense that nothing was ever quite enough. He moved frequently, changed schools, left jobs abruptly, always searching for something just out of reach. This period of Bundy's life, the late 1960s and early 1970s, was marked by significant social change in the United States. The country was reckoning with new ideas about civil rights, women's liberation, and the meaning of personal freedom. For many, it was a time of hope, but for others, it was unsettling, a challenge to traditional roles and expectations. Bundy, with his complicated sense of self and deep-seated insecurity, seemed both attracted to and threatened by these changes. He wanted to be seen as successful, admired, even extraordinary, but he struggled with feelings of inadequacy and the need to maintain a carefully constructed facade. By the early 1970s, Bundy was living once again in Seattle, balancing his law studies with work and a new relationship. Outwardly, his life looked full and successful. But friends noticed that his moods could swing from charming and enthusiastic to withdrawn and distant. At times, he seemed distracted or preoccupied, and while he rarely spoke openly about his past, he hinted at disappointments and dreams that had slipped away. Through these years, Bundy's sense of being an outsider, of always playing a role, seemed to deepen. He spent long hours alone, sometimes driving aimlessly or walking through the city at night. He was drawn to stories of power, control, and recognition, and told friends that he admired those who could shape their own destinies. Yet for all his ambitions, he remained a young man on the margins, never quite belonging, never quite satisfied with who he was. As the months passed, Bundy's charm and intelligence continued to open doors for him. He made friends in high places, received glowing recommendations, and seemed poised for real success. But beneath the surface, the patterns of secrecy, restlessness, and longing for validation continued to grow. The young man who had seemed so promising was now carrying the weight of old wounds and new disappointments, burdens that, in the years ahead, would lead to choices and consequences that would shake families, communities, and the nation itself. And so, the first chapter of Ted Bundy's life closes not with violence or infamy, but with a portrait of someone who could have been anyone, a child, a student, a friend, a son, struggling to find his place in the world. The tragedy that follows is not inevitable, but it is a reminder of the complexity of every life, and of the importance of paying attention, caring deeply, and holding close to the lessons of kindness, empathy, and connection. As we continue, we'll move gently through each chapter, remembering those who were lost, and honoring the truth that every life matters. There are some stories that shift so quietly at first, their beginnings can be difficult to trace. In Ted Bundy's life, the threshold between ordinary and extraordinary darkness was crossed not in a single moment, but in a series of steps so subtle that for a long time, almost no one noticed the change. The world he inhabited in the early 1970s was still familiar, one of universities and coffee shops, city parks and late-night conversations. The world did not know, could not know, that something far more disturbing was beginning to grow behind the mask. As the decade turned, Bundy's outward life was still marked by normal ambitions and daily routines. He had recently started law school in Seattle, pursuing a future in which he could be respected, perhaps even admired. He dated, socialized, and volunteered, blending into the hopeful, youthful energy of the campus. Yet even as friends and classmates continued to see him as friendly and capable, they began to sense a restlessness, a distance in his eyes, an unpredictability in his moods. Some noticed that Bundy could become intensely focused, sometimes even obsessive, about small disappointments or perceived slights. He could be charming and attentive, then suddenly withdrawn. It was in this atmosphere, with its blend of promise and unease, that the first stories began to surface. In January 1974, a young woman disappeared from her basement apartment near the University of Washington. The investigation was quiet at first, local and routine. Missing persons cases were not uncommon in a city of Seattle's size, and though friends and family were deeply worried, there was nothing yet to suggest something larger at work. But within weeks, a pattern began to emerge, one that would soon grip the city in a slow, spreading fear. That winter and spring, more young women vanished. Some disappeared while running errands, others from campus buildings, others in daylight, their absence marked only by the sudden quiet in the places they once filled. Each case, on its own, was troubling. Together, they hinted at something more, the possibility that someone was deliberately targeting women in their own neighborhoods, their own routines, their own familiar worlds. As weeks turned into months, the disappearances continued. The city, once so full of optimism, became watchful, anxious. Families kept in closer contact, friends traveled in pairs, and the streets near the university grew quiet after sunset. Police quietly increased patrols and advised caution, but there was still little to go on. The missing women were all young, intelligent, full of promise, and well liked by friends and family. Their lives had seemed safe, full of potential, a potential that was suddenly, and without explanation, cut short. It was in these months that the first public details began to emerge. Some witnesses described seeing a man, sometimes with a sling on his arm, sometimes appearing to need help, approaching young women and asking for assistance. Others remembered a Volkswagen Beetle, light brown or tan, sometimes parked near the scenes of the disappearances. The details were few, and always a little uncertain, but the sense of unease continued to grow. The city's attention, once focused on the promise of a new decade, now turned inward, scanning for danger in every familiar place. Bundy, meanwhile, continued to move through his life with apparent normalcy. He studied for law exams, attended social events, and called on friends. He was, as always, skilled at presenting himself as trustworthy and likable. In moments of tension, he was calm and measured, able to put people at ease with a well-timed joke or an attentive conversation. Those who knew him best sometimes noticed flashes of arrogance or impatience, an underlying need to be admired, to be seen as exceptional, but few suspected anything beyond the normal difficulties of young adulthood. For the families of the missing, life was changed forever. The pain of not knowing, the endless questions, and the fear that lingered in every quiet moment were now daily realities. The city became a place of both hope and dread, as parents and friends posted flyers, organized searches, and waited for news. The police, too, were under increasing pressure, scrambling for clues, re-interviewing witnesses, and trying to fit together the pieces of a puzzle that stubbornly refused to resolve. By summer, the disappearances had drawn attention beyond Seattle. News reports began to appear in regional and then national outlets, each one painting a picture of a city in the grip of a mystery. Detectives began to coordinate across state lines, sharing information and theories. Some believed the cases might be connected to similar disappearances in nearby Oregon, or even in California, but the evidence was still circumstantial, a pattern of similarities rather than a clear line of connection. It was in July 1974 that the case reached a new and deeply unsettling turning point. On a sunny Sunday afternoon at Lake Sammamish State Park, two young women went missing within hours of each other, both last seen in the company of a man who introduced himself as Ted. He wore a sling on his arm and asked for help loading a sailboat onto his car, a Volkswagen Beetle. Witnesses described him as handsome, well-spoken, and friendly. The brazenness of the approach, the daylight, the busy setting, all of it shocked the community. For the first time, police had a name and a description, though both were so common as to be almost useless. Still, it was a start, and it gave shape to a fear that was no longer abstract. The investigation now accelerated. Police released a composite sketch and asked the public for tips. Hundreds of calls poured in, many naming people who had no connection to the case, others offering sightings of men named Ted with Volkswagens. Among the names submitted, one among many, was that of Ted Bundy, suggested by a former girlfriend and a professor. But Bundy, clean-cut and seemingly above suspicion, did not fit the picture of a criminal in most people's minds. His life, outwardly, remained uninterrupted. Through the rest of 1974, similar disappearances occurred across the Pacific Northwest. Each new case brought renewed fear and heartbreak, and the search expanded from Washington into Oregon and Utah. Bundy, by this time, had moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school. There, too, he blended into the community, making new friends, continuing to volunteer, and presenting himself as a young man on the cusp of professional success. The pattern, tragically, followed him. Disappearances and attempted abductions began to occur in Utah, echoing those that had shaken Seattle. The public anxiety grew sharper, especially among young women and their families. College campuses hosted self-defense classes, and dormitories posted warnings. Students who once walked freely across campus at night now traveled in groups or stayed home. It was a shift not just in behavior, but in the very sense of what safety meant, an understanding that the world could change in an instant, and that sometimes danger wore the face of a friend or a neighbor. Throughout this time, Bundy continued to be overlooked by police. He remained, in public and in private, careful and composed. He kept up appearances, wrote letters home, and continued to study law, though his grades had begun to slip. He told friends and family that he missed Seattle, but rarely spoke about the cases that so preoccupied everyone else. His life was, as always, divided into compartments, each one carefully maintained, each one shielded from the others by his skill at deception. For detectives, the investigation was a daily grind of uncertainty. Leads appeared and vanished. Witnesses offered conflicting memories. The man named Ted was still only a possibility, one among hundreds. The Volkswagen Beetle was a common car, and the name itself, Ted, so ordinary as to be nearly useless as evidence. Still, the police pressed on, compiling files, mapping disappearances, and holding on to the hope that a breakthrough would come. As 1974 turned to 1975, the country was watching. News stories painted Bundy's crimes as both a mystery and a tragedy, a symbol of innocence lost and the complexity of evil. For many families, the holidays brought only fresh sorrow, and the new year arrived without answers. But the story, though still hidden from most, was moving toward a turning point. For Ted Bundy, the balance between his carefully managed exterior and the darkness within was growing harder to maintain. For the police and the public, the question was not whether the disappearances would stop, but when someone would finally see through the mask. The community, wounded but resilient, continued to hope for answers, to seek justice, and to honor those who were lost with the simple act of remembering. In the shadows of a city still searching for meaning, the next chapter was already beginning. And as the truth drew closer, the world would learn just how thin the line between ordinary and unimaginable can sometimes be. As the months passed, the sense of unease that had quietly gripped the Pacific Northwest became something larger, a national anxiety, an undercurrent of fear that stretched from city to city, campus to campus. The story that began as a few unexplained disappearances now filled the evening news, the front pages, the conversations between friends and strangers alike. The mystery deepened even as new details emerged, each one serving both as a warning and a plea for vigilance. Bundy, meanwhile, had made his way to Salt Lake City. He was, once again, the new arrival, a law student, ambitious, personable, unremarkable in the way that so many wanted desperately to believe. He made friends easily, found work, and even became involved with a new relationship. His surface life, as always, provided cover for a reality that no one suspected. Yet it was here, in Utah, that cracks would first begin to appear in his carefully constructed mask. The fall of 1974 brought a series of cases that would haunt both Utah and Colorado. Young women disappeared from their routines, from walks home, from parking lots, from quiet evenings with friends. In each instance, the families left behind experienced a grief and confusion impossible to measure, an absence that settled into their lives and refused to fade. The police worked tirelessly, combing through lists, interviewing witnesses, piecing together timelines that always seemed to fall short of an answer. There was talk now, among law enforcement, of a pattern, a similarity to the cases in Washington and Oregon, a possible connection to the mysterious Ted, who had last been seen at Lake Sammamish. Despite growing suspicion, Bundy remained outwardly calm, moving through his days with the same blend of affability and ambition that had always helped him blend in. He joined the local LDS church, participated in social activities, and made friends who would later struggle to reconcile the man they knew with the headlines that would follow. It is a tragic truth of such stories that the face of danger can so often look like anyone else, that trust is not always protection. In the late autumn, as the days grew shorter, there were moments of hope, reports of near escapes, of women who sensed danger and fled, of witnesses who remembered crucial details. These stories, told and retold among friends and in the press, became small beacons of resistance, reminders that courage and intuition could sometimes turn the tide, that not all dangers were invisible if you looked closely enough. Yet for many families, the waiting continued, a wait for news, for justice, for something that could bring meaning to their loss. In Colorado, too, the shadow spread. Cases in the ski town of Aspen and in Boulder bore chilling similarities to those now haunting the West. Investigators in several states began to correspond, comparing notes, looking for links in dates, descriptions, methods. The cooperation was slow and sometimes hindered by the limits of the era: paper records, slow communication, the sheer geography of the American West. But it marked a turning point. The story was no longer local. It was a network of stories, each one connected by the shared hope that someone, somewhere, could stop the pattern before it continued. Bundy, perhaps sensing the pressure or perhaps simply restless, traveled frequently between Utah and Colorado. He was skilled at blending in, at changing jobs or routines when the need arose, at presenting himself in just the right way to avoid suspicion. But the fabric of his double life was beginning to fray. Police in Utah, acting on tips and evidence from attempted abductions, began to compile a list of suspects. For the first time, Bundy's name appeared not as a curiosity but as a possibility, one among several, but a possibility nonetheless. As the winter of 1974 passed into 1975, the fear and confusion gave way to action. Self-defense classes became common on campuses. Students walked in groups or stayed indoors at night. Many families, even those untouched directly by the disappearances, changed their routines, locking doors, checking in more often, teaching daughters and sisters to be cautious in ways that would have once seemed unimaginable. These changes were acts of love, acts of resilience, each one a response to the uncertainty, each one a refusal to surrender entirely to fear. The police, for their part, were relentless. Undercover operations, stakeouts, interviews that lasted deep into the night. They were not always successful, and at times the case seemed impossibly tangled, but the work was constant. Each new piece of information was another thread in a tapestry that, by degrees, was being made clearer. The families waited. The country watched. And Bundy, for all his skill at deception, could not hide forever. Then, in August 1975, a quiet, almost mundane event marked the first real break in the case. In a suburb near Salt Lake City, police noticed a suspicious car, a tan Volkswagen Beetle, driving erratically in a residential neighborhood. When they stopped the car and searched it, they found a collection of items, masks, rope, handcuffs, and other tools that could not be easily explained. The driver was Ted Bundy. It was not yet the end, but it was the beginning of the unraveling. Police brought Bundy in for questioning, comparing him to composite sketches and witness statements from previous cases. His charm was still effective, his explanations plausible, but the coincidence was too great to ignore. Over the following weeks, detectives gathered more evidence, linking Bundy to unsolved cases in several states. Witnesses identified him in lineups, survivors pointed to him as the man who had tried to lure them, and investigators matched the car to earlier reports. Bundy was arrested, initially on suspicion of attempted kidnapping. As he awaited trial, investigators dug deeper into his background, his movements, his habits. The work was painstaking, checking travel records, reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses. It was during this time that the scope of his crimes began to become clear, that the connections across state lines, across months and years, could finally be traced. For those involved in the search, it was a mixture of relief and heartbreak. Relief that the pattern might be ending, heartbreak for those who would never come home. The communities that had been living in fear for more than a year now watched as the case unfolded. News reports carried the story nationwide, detailing the arrest and the slow, careful building of a case against Bundy. Families of the missing waited for answers, often learning details only when the police could confirm them. It was a time of mixed emotions: hope for justice, sorrow for the losses already suffered, and a shared determination that the truth, at last, should be told. Bundy, for his part, maintained his innocence. He was charming, articulate, even helpful to investigators at times. He wrote letters, gave interviews, and worked on his own defense with the skill and confidence of someone who still believed he could talk his way out of anything. But the weight of the evidence was growing, and the world around him was changing. The story had shifted, from the confusion of disappearances to the slow, determined process of seeking justice. For the families, the process was never easy. The legal proceedings moved slowly. There were hearings, delays, changes of venue. The grief did not end with Bundy's arrest. In some ways, it only grew deeper, as old wounds were reopened and new questions emerged. Yet through it all, the families endured, supporting one another, keeping the memory of their loved ones alive in the face of uncertainty. They became, quietly and without fanfare, symbols of resilience. In the end, it was not one piece of evidence but the accumulation of many witness statements, physical evidence, patterns that could no longer be denied, that finally made the case against Bundy. As the winter of 1975 gave way to spring, the outline of his double life was now clear for all to see. The young man who had seemed so ordinary, so promising, was now revealed as someone very different. The communities he touched would never be the same. The story of Ted Bundy was far from over. The trials to come would capture national attention, raising new questions about justice, safety, and the meaning of evil in an ordinary world. For the families and survivors, there would be years of waiting and grieving, of searching for answers and holding on to memories. And for a nation that had watched the story unfold, there was a lesson about the importance of vigilance, the power of community, and the need always to remember those whose lives were lost. With Bundy's arrest in Utah, a cautious sense of hope began to ripple through the communities that had lived for too long with unanswered questions and lingering fear. The moment itself, an unremarkable traffic stop, a careful search, the quiet click of handcuffs, was the kind of everyday event that usually disappears into the background of city life. But for those who had watched the mystery unfold, it marked the beginning of a slow, difficult reckoning. For the families of the missing, it was not yet closure, but it was something, a name, a face, and perhaps at last the first step toward justice. The first charges were for attempted kidnapping, a case built on the testimony of a young woman who had managed to escape from Bundy's grasp. Her courage in coming forward became a catalyst for a deeper investigation. Prosecutors in Utah pressed forward, while police in other states quietly began to share information, comparing notes on disappearances that had troubled their communities for months. It was a time of anxious waiting and slow progress, a process of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and fitting together the scattered pieces of a puzzle that spanned hundreds of miles. Bundy, meanwhile, maintained an air of calm confidence. In jail, he spoke easily with investigators, often seeming eager to help clarify the record, to explain away coincidences, to offer plausible explanations for troubling details. He appeared in court clean-cut and composed, representing himself with the skill and charm that had so often served him well. He argued motions, questioned witnesses, and at times even seemed to enjoy the attention, as if the courtroom were just another stage on which to perform. For the families of victims, this was a difficult spectacle to witness. The man they saw in court was not a shadowy figure lurking in the night, but a young man in a suit, articulate and polite, occasionally smiling or cracking a joke. The disconnect between the horror they felt and the image before them only deepened the pain. It is one of the cruelties of such stories that evil so often wears an ordinary face, that justice can sometimes feel too polite, too slow, too bound by the rituals and rules of the system. Still, the work of justice moved forward. Investigators in Utah worked alongside colleagues in Washington, Colorado, and Oregon, gradually assembling a case that stretched across years and state lines. The evidence was painstaking to collect. Some of it was circumstantial, a pattern of travel, a matching description, a car seen at just the right time. Some was more concrete. Personal items found in Bundy's car, eyewitness accounts, testimonies from survivors who recognized his face or remembered his voice. It was a case built piece by piece, held together by the shared determination of police, prosecutors, and families who refused to give up. As the trial for the attempted kidnapping approached, Bundy's demeanor shifted. The easy confidence sometimes gave way to flashes of anger or frustration, particularly when his motions were denied or when evidence seemed to pile up against him. Still, he was a master at controlling his image, careful to appear thoughtful and reasonable when it mattered most. News reporters covering the case struggled to reconcile the man they saw with the stories they heard, and the public, too, was divided, some convinced of his guilt, others unwilling to believe that someone so outwardly normal could be capable of such harm. In February 1976, Bundy was convicted of the attempted kidnapping in Utah. It was a small measure of justice, a single verdict in a case that stretched far beyond the courtroom walls. He was sentenced to prison, but for investigators and families, the work was far from over. The conviction opened the door to new charges in Colorado, where Bundy would soon be extradited to face trial for the murder of Karen Campbell, a young nurse who had disappeared from a hotel in Aspen in 1975. The process of extradition, hearings, and preparation for a new trial was slow and exhausting. The legal system, by design, is deliberate, careful, intent on protecting the rights of all involved. For families waiting for answers, the pace could feel excruciating. Each delay, each procedural setback, was a reminder that justice is never as swift or as certain as people wish it could be. Bundy, for his part, adapted quickly to life behind bars. He continued to represent himself in legal proceedings, poring over case files, filing motions, and sometimes offering to help investigators in exchange for privileges. His confidence seemed unshaken, and he rarely betrayed any sign of fear or remorse. He wrote letters to friends and supporters, giving the impression of a man wronged by circumstance, misunderstood by the world. For some, this performance was convincing. For others, it only deepened their suspicions. It was during his time in Colorado that Bundy's cunning and determination took a dramatic turn. In June 1977, while being held in the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, he managed to escape by leaping from a second-story window during a break in proceedings. The escape was almost surreal, a moment out of a novel, not real life. Bundy disappeared into the mountains, triggering a massive search effort that lasted nearly a week. Local residents and tourists alike were drawn into the anxiety and disruption, their quiet town transformed overnight into the focus of national attention. Bundy was recaptured after several days, cold and hungry, and returned to custody. The escape was brief, but it left an indelible mark on all involved. For the families, it was a fresh wound, a reminder of how fragile justice can be, how quickly order can slip into chaos. For the police and prosecutors, it was a lesson in vigilance, a stark warning about the need for constant attention to detail. And yet, the story did not end there. 6 months later, in December 1977, Bundy escaped again, this time from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He had lost weight, studied the jail's routines, and managed to squeeze through a hole in the ceiling of his cell. While guards watched his empty bed, Bundy walked out of the jail and into the night, driving east and then south, evading capture for weeks. The news of the second escape sent shockwaves across the country. For those who had lived in fear, then hope, then uncertainty, it was almost too much to bear. Families worried not just for themselves, but for every community in Bundy's path. The police mounted a nationwide search, sharing information with colleagues across state lines, working late into the night to close the gaps that had allowed Bundy to slip away. The sense of safety that had slowly begun to return was shattered once more. Bundy's journey after his escape was a winding, desperate path. He traveled through the Midwest, stealing cars, money, and supplies, moving from state to state in an effort to stay ahead of law enforcement. For a time, it seemed as if he might disappear entirely, vanish into the endless possibilities of the American landscape. But Bundy was never a man content to stay hidden for long. In January 1978, he arrived in Florida, a world away from the mountains and snow of Colorado, but carrying with him the same restless, destructive energy. The events that would follow in Florida would mark the final, most infamous chapter in Bundy's story. For the nation, it was a moment of reckoning, a realization that justice, so often hoped for, is never guaranteed, that safety is always something to be tended, guarded, and cherished. For the families and communities already touched by loss, it was a time of renewed pain, but also of resolve, a promise to remember, to bear witness, and to never let the story end with silence. Through it all, the work of healing continued. Parents and siblings, friends and neighbors, survivors and searchers, all held to the truth that every life lost mattered, that every story deserved to be told. Bundy's escapes and legal battles, his manipulation of the system, and the chaos that followed served as a reminder that evil, when it comes, is rarely simple and never easy to understand. But against that darkness, the strength of community, the persistence of memory, and the pursuit of justice shone through. The end of the story was coming. But for those who lived through it, and for the generations who would remember, it was never just about one man. It was always about the value of every life, the need for vigilance, and the importance of holding on to hope, even in the longest nights. In the early days of 1978, as most people greeted a new year with quiet hope, Ted Bundy was slipping quietly into Florida, a world apart from the cold mountains and vigilant police of Colorado. His journey there was desperate and disjointed, marked by stolen cars, restless nights, and the uneasy knowledge that the country was searching for him. He moved through small towns and big cities, staying in cheap hotels, using stolen identification, trying to appear as just another face in the crowd. For Bundy, Florida was a last refuge. For the communities he entered, it was a chapter still unwritten, their peace unbroken, for now. But it would not last. After weeks on the run, Bundy arrived in Tallahassee, blending into the transient world of college students and young workers. He rented a room at a boarding house, paid cash, and went by a new name. For those around him, he was a stranger, quiet, sometimes friendly, sometimes distant, just another newcomer finding his place. The city was busy with the rhythms of university life, students returning from break, classes beginning, laughter echoing down the streets at night. Yet beneath the surface, Bundy was restless and anxious. He had little money, no reliable friends, and the stress of living under a false identity weighed on him. His desperation grew as days passed, the familiar patterns of compulsion and violence building toward a breaking point. And on the night of January 15, 1978, that point was reached at the Chi Omega sorority house on the campus of Florida State University. The events of that night would become some of the most infamous in American crime history, not because of their brutality, but because of the way they shattered the illusion of safety. In the span of minutes, 2 young women, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, lost their lives, and 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were left seriously injured. The attack was swift, silent, and devastating. For the survivors, the trauma would echo for a lifetime. For the campus, it was an unthinkable violation, a reminder that even the most familiar places can become sites of terror. The response from the university, the city, and the nation was immediate and profound. Police launched a massive investigation, canvassing the campus, interviewing students, collecting evidence, and warning the public to take every precaution. The news spread quickly. A violent intruder was at large, and the community closed ranks. Parents called their children. Friends checked on one another. Doors were locked, routines changed, and fear settled over Tallahassee like a shadow. For Bundy, the night did not end at Chi Omega. Hours later, he entered another apartment nearby and attacked Cheryl Thomas, a student and dancer who, like so many others, had begun her evening expecting nothing but the ordinary. She survived, though her life was changed forever. It was this relentless violence, the inability to stop, the indifference to boundaries or warnings, that distinguished Bundy's final spree. He was not simply running from justice now. He was spinning out of control, his world narrowing to the chaos and compulsion that had haunted him for years. In the days that followed, Bundy remained at large, moving through the city's neighborhoods, taking what he needed to survive. He stole a car, tried to blend in, but his luck was running out. He was no longer as careful or composed as he had once been, and the net was closing. The Florida police, now on high alert, coordinated with agencies from across the country. There were press conferences, public warnings, and an outpouring of support for the victims and their families. The search for Bundy ended less than a month later, on February 15, 1978, in the small town of Pensacola, Florida. A police officer, David Lee, noticed a suspicious car in a parking lot and checked the plates. The car was stolen. Lee approached the driver, who tried to flee on foot before being apprehended after a brief struggle. Bundy, exhausted and gone from weeks on the run, offered a false name at first, but his true identity was quickly discovered. The news of his capture brought a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. For many, there was hope that the ordeal might at last be coming to an end. For the families of victims, it was a moment of bittersweet closure, an answer, perhaps, but not the one they wished for. Bundy's arrest in Florida marked a turning point in the national consciousness. His name and face became known across the country, the details of his crimes recounted in newspapers and on television. But even as the story grew, it was never only about him. It was about the women whose lives had been taken or forever changed, about the families who had waited in anguish for news, about the communities that had come together in fear and in grief. The nation, watching from afar, mourned for those lost and wondered how such violence could exist alongside so much that was good. The legal process began again, this time in Florida. Bundy was charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, as well as other related crimes. The evidence was overwhelming: witnesses, physical traces, a trail of stolen cars and forged documents. The case drew enormous attention, with journalists and true crime writers descending on Tallahassee to cover every detail. The trial, when it came, would be one of the first in American history to be televised, bringing the proceedings into living rooms across the country. Yet for all the spectacle, the heart of the story remained unchanged: families, friends, and survivors searching for justice and peace in the aftermath of violence. For many, the courtroom was both a battleground and a sanctuary, a place where the truth, no matter how painful, could finally be spoken. The women who testified showed courage and resolve, refusing to let fear or memory silence them. Their voices became a powerful counter to the darkness that had entered their lives. Bundy, as always, acted as his own attorney at times, questioning witnesses, objecting to evidence, and trying to control the narrative. He was skilled at performance, sometimes charming, sometimes belligerent, always aware of the cameras and the attention. For those who watched, there was an uncomfortable fascination with the contradiction: a man so outwardly composed, yet responsible for so much suffering. But the trial was never about him, not truly. It was about the people whose lives had been torn apart, and the hope that, in the end, justice might finally be done. As the case moved forward, other stories emerged. Police in Florida and across the country worked to tie Bundy to unsolved cases, to offer answers to families who still waited for closure. Each discovery was a reminder that the true cost of his crimes could never be fully measured, that every loss was personal, unique, and deserving of remembrance. The survivors who spoke in court did so not just for themselves, but for all those whose stories would never be heard. The trial ended in July 1979, with Bundy convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to death, a sentence that, for many, was as much a symbol as a solution. It was an end to a chapter, but not the end of pain. The appeals and legal maneuvers would stretch on for years, and the memories for a lifetime. Yet through it all, the strength of the families and survivors endured. They came together to support one another, to honor those lost, and to advocate for changes that might protect others in the future. For the nation, the capture and conviction of Ted Bundy marked the beginning of a reckoning, not just with one man's crimes, but with the vulnerability and resilience of society itself. In the aftermath, there would be debates about law enforcement, about the nature of evil, about the ways communities respond to tragedy. There would be changes in policing, in campus safety, in the ways victim stories are told and remembered. The lessons would be hard-won, and the grief would never truly fade, but there was, at last, a sense that the darkness could be faced. As Bundy entered the long process of appeals and interviews, and as journalists and psychologists tried to make sense of what had happened, the world watched, listened, and reflected. The victims were never forgotten. Their names, faces, and dreams remained at the center of every conversation. In their memory, families and survivors continued to speak, to share, and to hope for justice, for healing, for a world a little safer, a little kinder than the one that had been changed forever by the acts of a single man. After the trial ended and Ted Bundy was sentenced to death, the bright lights of the courtroom faded, but the work of reckoning was far from over. For families, for survivors, and for the country itself, there began a new chapter defined less by spectacle and more by waiting, reflection, and the slow process of coming to terms with a pain that no sentence could erase. Bundy's arrival on Florida's death row at Rayford Prison brought a new rhythm to the years that followed. Life there was marked by routine and monotony, an endless cycle of appeals, interviews, and shifting hopes. Outside the prison's walls, the world moved on, families grieved, children grew up, communities rebuilt, but the legacy of what had happened lingered, woven into the fabric of memory. For the investigators who had spent years chasing answers, there was both relief and frustration. The trial had provided a measure of justice, but there were still so many questions, so many names left unspoken, so many families without the peace of certainty. Bundy himself was rarely still. Even in prison, he remained a manipulator, charming journalists, stringing along would-be supporters, and inserting himself into the national conversation on crime and punishment. He gave interviews to psychologists and reporters, sometimes feigning insight, sometimes spinning stories, always keeping those around him guessing about his true motives. Some believed he wanted fame, others thought he hoped for some last-minute reprieve. For the families of victims, each new headline or television special was a fresh wound, another reminder that justice, even when served, can never fully silence the past. The appeals process wound its way through the courts. Bundy's lawyers filed motions, challenged procedures, questioned evidence, and argued points of law, stretching the case over years. At each stage, the survivors and the families of those lost waited, sometimes with anger, sometimes with hope, but always with the knowledge that true closure might never come. For many, the long delays brought frustration. Justice seemed elusive, always just out of reach. Others found comfort in the rituals of remembrance, candlelight vigils, memorials, shared stories. In the face of so much loss, there was a determination not to let the past become only pain. During his time on death row, Bundy continued to play his old roles, shifting between defiance and false remorse. He corresponded with people who wrote to him, some seeking understanding, others offering support. He spoke with criminal profilers and psychologists, at times providing details about crimes long suspected but never solved. These confessions, however, came sparingly and often only when it suited him, more bargaining chips than true attempts at honesty. In his last years, he sometimes hinted at additional victims, feeding both hope and anguish for families who still waited for answers. For law enforcement, these final interviews became a last effort to bring closure to unsolved cases. Detectives traveled to Florida, hoping that Bundy, facing the end, would finally provide the truth about missing daughters and sisters. Sometimes he did, offering fragments of information, confirming long-held suspicions, or guiding searchers to places long forgotten by everyone but those who mourned. Other times, his answers were evasive or contradictory, a pattern of cruelty and manipulation that outlasted even the reach of the law. Still, for a few families, those late confessions brought a kind of peace, a chance to lay loved ones to rest and to finally say goodbye. As the years stretched on, the case continued to shape the national conversation. Bundy's story was discussed not only in terms of crime, but as a catalyst for change. Investigators and journalists examined the failings and successes of the police work that had ultimately brought him to justice. New laws and investigative techniques were developed in response to the lessons learned, more coordination across states, better sharing of information, the rise of forensic science, and an increased focus on the needs and voices of victims and their families. The ripples of the case extended far beyond the prison walls. reaching into classrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across America. The survivors, too, became part of this ongoing story. Some chose to speak publicly, sharing their experiences in hopes of preventing future tragedies. Others focused on private healing, building lives around the empty spaces left behind but refusing to let those losses define them. Their strength, quietly displayed, became a testament to the resilience of those who endure, an answer to violence that could not be silenced by any one sentence or trial. For every family and community touched by loss, the years were marked by both sorrow and courage, by an enduring refusal to let darkness have the last word. The country, for its part, grappled with difficult questions. There were debates about the death penalty, about whether justice was best served by execution or by the certainty of life in prison. There were questions about the role of the media, about the fascination and fear that surrounded cases like Bundy's, and about the ways in which stories of violence both draw us in and demand that we reflect on our own values and priorities. In the wake of tragedy, there was no single answer, only the ongoing work of seeking truth, remembering those lost, and striving for a safer, more compassionate world. Throughout his time on death row, Bundy continued to insist on his own narrative, rarely admitting the full extent of his crimes. For some, this refusal was a final act of cruelty. For others, it was simply a reminder that evil, when it comes, is rarely interested in closure or reconciliation. Yet even in his silence, there was progress. The dedication of families, investigators, and survivors ensured that the victims were never forgotten, that their stories would outlast the man who tried to erase them. As the date of execution drew near, Florida's prison became a place of gathering, journalists waiting for news, supporters and protesters holding vigils outside the gates, families and law enforcement officials preparing for a chapter to close. Bundy himself continued to grant interviews, making last-minute confessions, sometimes offering apologies, sometimes maintaining his innocence. The contradictions remained until the end. In those final days, the nation looked on with a complicated mix of relief, sadness, and unresolved questions. For some, the execution represented justice, a necessary ending to a story that had brought so much pain. For others, it was a somber reminder of loss, of years spent searching for answers, of lives forever changed by events no one could have foreseen or prevented. For all, it was a moment to remember those whose voices could not be heard, whose stories could not be told except by those who loved them. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, crowds gathered, some in mourning, some in grim celebration, some simply present to witness history. Inside, the process was formal, quiet, observed by a select group of officials, law enforcement officers, and a few witnesses. The man whose crimes had haunted so many for so long was, at last, gone. But the story, of course, did not end with that final act. For the families, the pain endured, mingled now with the knowledge that at least one chapter was closed. For investigators, there remained cold cases, unsolved mysteries, questions that would never be answered. For the nation, there was the memory of a long and difficult journey, a reminder of vulnerability, but also of the power of resilience and the importance of remembrance. As the years have passed, Bundy's case has continued to be studied, discussed, and debated. His name is invoked less for who he was and more for the lessons his crimes taught: the need for vigilance, the imperative of community, the responsibility to listen and believe survivors, and the vital importance of honoring those whose lives were lost. The faces and names of the victims, remembered in vigils, in memorials, in the ongoing work of their families and communities, are the truest legacy of the story. Against the backdrop of pain and fear, they stand as enduring reminders that every life is precious, every story worth telling, and every act of remembrance a quiet victory over the darkness that once seemed insurmountable. When the gates finally closed behind the story of Ted Bundy, a strange hush lingered. The man whose actions had haunted so many was gone, but the echoes of what he'd done moved on, finding quiet corners in the lives of families, survivors, and the communities that had carried the burden for so long. Some wounds, raw and open for years, were not soothed by the finality of an execution. The grief did not vanish. The questions did not resolve. Yet, in the space that followed, something else slowly began to grow, a search for meaning, and in time, a gentle kind of hope. For the families of the lost and the survivors who endured, the years that followed were marked by both pain and resilience. In the first weeks after Bundy's death, there was a wave of public attention, a flurry of articles, interviews, retrospectives. Some families chose to speak, hoping that telling their stories would help prevent future tragedies, that their daughters, sisters, and friends would be remembered as more than statistics or headlines. Others kept their grief close, retreating from the public eye, finding comfort in small routines and private rituals of remembrance. Each journey was different, but all were united by a refusal to let violence be the last word. Remembrance became an act of resistance. Parents planted trees or established scholarships in their daughters' names. University campuses installed memorial benches, created safer spaces, and welcomed the stories of those who survived and those who did not. In living rooms and church basements, in gatherings small and large, people spoke the names of the lost, shared their laughter and dreams, and held each other close in moments of quiet reflection. It was never about erasing the pain, but about ensuring it had meaning, about turning tragedy into a foundation for something better. The survivors, too, became beacons for others. Some spoke out publicly, bravely revisiting the darkest chapters of their lives to advocate for change. Their voices, once nearly lost in the fear and confusion of those long-ago nights, became a rallying point for victims everywhere. They spoke of trauma and healing, of the power of community, and the importance of listening and believing those who come forward with their own stories. Each act of courage, each word of testimony, became a lifeline for someone else, proof that suffering need not be suffered alone. The law enforcement community changed, too, transformed by lessons learned at high cost. Officers and detectives who had worked the Bundy case dedicated their later careers to training others, emphasizing collaboration across jurisdictions, the necessity of trusting victims, the critical role of forensic science, and the need for swift, coordinated action in the face of emerging threats. Police departments built new systems for sharing information, and the field of criminal profiling, still in its infancy when Bundy was first arrested, began to mature, offering insights that would help catch dangerous offenders before they could do more harm. One of the most profound shifts was in how society viewed violence against women. The conversation sparked by Bundy's crimes became part of a much larger dialogue about safety, respect, and equality. Universities and colleges invested in campus safety programs, offering self-defense courses, creating better lighting and secure housing, and improving protocols for reporting and responding to threats. Women's centers flourished, providing resources, counseling, and advocacy. The refrain, "Always remember, never forget," echoed not just in memorial services, but in new laws, new educational campaigns, and new attitudes towards supporting victims and preventing harm. The media, too, looked inward, examining its role in covering crime stories. The spectacle of Bundy's trials, broadcast live to millions, dissected and analyzed by experts, prompted hard questions about the balance between informing the public and honoring the dignity of those harmed. Some coverage had leaned towards sensationalism, focusing on the killer rather than the killed, but many journalists grew more thoughtful, prioritizing empathy, accuracy, and the centrality of victims' voices in their reporting. For the communities directly touched by Bundy's actions, healing was a long road. The shockwaves moved outward in ripples, affecting friends, classmates, teachers, neighbors, and strangers who had come together during the years of searching, waiting, and hoping. In time, many found ways to rebuild. Some held annual events, walks for awareness, or simple gatherings where candles were lit and moments of silence kept. These acts, repeated year after year, became part of the fabric of communal life, a reminder of both the pain that had been endured and the strength that had carried people through. For investigators, the story was both a personal and professional legacy. Some retired with the case still on their minds, the faces of the missing never far from their thoughts. Others spent years poring over cold cases, driven by the hope that even a small detail might bring answers to another grieving family. The sense of unfinished business, of lives interrupted, stories left untold, was both a sorrow and a motivator. Even as new technology and investigative methods changed the landscape, the core truth remained: every victim mattered, and no case was too old to pursue. Bundy's crimes also left a mark on the justice system itself. Questions about the death penalty, about the length and complexity of appeals, and about the responsibilities of defense and prosecution became the subject of national debate. For some, Bundy's fate seemed a necessary conclusion, a line drawn under an era of fear. For others, it was a prompt to reflect on the value of life, the purpose of punishment, and the role of mercy and forgiveness in a world that too often seemed ruled by violence. Yet above all, the aftermath was shaped by quiet acts of love. Families supporting each other across the distances of geography and time. Survivors mentoring others who had been hurt. Strangers offering comfort at memorials, or writing letters of support, or raising funds for charities in the names of the lost. These gestures did not erase the sorrow, but they proved that kindness, however small, could push back against despair. In the decades that followed, as generations came and went, the lessons of Bundy's story continued to resonate. Young women grew up hearing the warnings, yes, but also the wisdom: trust your instincts, look out for one another, and never be ashamed to ask for help. Parents taught their children to be cautious, but also to be compassionate, to recognize that evil can sometimes look ordinary, and that goodness is found in how we respond. Even now, when the headlines have faded and the immediacy of fear has passed, the names of the lost endure. Their families keep their memories alive, in photographs, in laughter, in the small, daily acts of remembrance that shape a legacy of love. They are not just victims of a crime, they are daughters and sisters, friends and classmates, whose lives, though interrupted, continue to ripple outward in ways large and small. In the end, what emerged from the darkness was not just a story of pain, but a story of community, courage, and the enduring power of memory. The families, the survivors, the investigators, and the communities all became keepers of that story, guardians against forgetting, witnesses to the truth that even the deepest wounds can, with time and care, begin to heal. In the years after Ted Bundy's crimes, the United States found itself grappling not just with the details of a single case, but with the deeper questions it raised about safety, psychology, and the society in which such tragedy could occur. The echoes of what happened did not fade with the close of the legal record. Instead, they became part of a wider conversation, one that shaped how Americans thought about violence, trust, and the fragile boundaries between the ordinary and the unimaginable. One of the most profound shifts was in how the nation viewed crime and personal safety. The string of disappearances that began in the Pacific Northwest had, for many, shattered the illusion that certain places, campuses, parks, busy neighborhoods, were immune to danger. The reality that harm could come from someone who seemed normal, someone who moved unnoticed through familiar spaces, changed the way people moved through the world. Advice that once seemed unnecessary, lock your doors, don't walk alone, trust your instincts, became everyday wisdom. These changes were not born of paranoia, but of the collective understanding that vigilance was an act of care, a way to protect the people we loved. Communities and institutions responded, often in deeply personal ways. College campuses introduced new safety protocols, improved lighting, established campus escort programs, and hosted forums where students could voice their concerns. Self-defense classes became more common, and survivors of violence were offered more support and resources than ever before. These efforts did not erase the pain of what had happened, but they created spaces where people could reclaim a sense of agency, where the lessons learned were used to foster both caution and connection. The Bundy case also accelerated the growth of criminal profiling and forensic science. Law enforcement agencies began to work together more closely, sharing information across jurisdictions and investing in specialized units that could track patterns and behaviors. The Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded its behavioral science unit, drawing insights from the Bundy investigation to train officers across the country in how to recognize the warning signs of serial offenders. Advances in forensic technology, fingerprinting, DNA analysis, evidence preservation, were fueled by the need to prevent similar tragedies in the future. These tools would, in time, help solve cases and bring long-awaited answers to other families, a legacy of progress born from pain. Perhaps most powerfully, the Bundy case forced the nation to confront its fascination with stories of crime and evil. As Bundy's trials played out on television and his face appeared in newspapers and magazines, the question of how to report such stories, and how much attention to give the person responsible, became a subject of debate. Many began to recognize that focusing on the killer's charisma or background could unintentionally overshadow the voices of victims and survivors. Over time, a shift took place. Journalists, filmmakers, and authors became more intentional in their storytelling, centering the humanity of those harmed, and inviting audiences to remember that every crime is a shattering loss for real people. This changing perspective was visible in the documentaries, books, and interviews that followed. Survivors and families were asked to share not just the pain, but the lives, hopes, and dreams of those taken. Communities held vigils and built memorials not as reminders of fear, but as affirmations of resilience. In classrooms, students discussed not only the facts of the case but also the ethics of storytelling, how to balance the need to remember with the responsibility to honor and protect the dignity of the lost. The world of psychology, too, was changed. Bundy's willingness to speak with experts in his final years, sometimes honestly, sometimes not, sparked new research into the roots of violence and the warning signs that can precede it. Mental health professionals studied his interviews, searching for patterns that might help prevent future tragedies, while also learning to be cautious about the limits of what a manipulative subject might reveal. The case prompted more nuanced conversations about nature and nurture, about the interplay of personal trauma, social alienation, and moral choice. As the public reckoned with these new understandings, the victims' families and friends continued their quieter, more personal journey. Some found comfort in advocacy, working to improve missing persons investigations, supporting survivors, or teaching others about the importance of trust and intuition. Others focused on private acts of remembrance, keeping journals, planting gardens, telling stories on anniversaries. In both public and private, the work of healing was ongoing, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always real. For the investigators who had worked the case, the impact was lasting. Many spent the rest of their careers dedicated to bringing justice to victims of violent crime, drawing on the lessons learned to solve new cases. They taught younger officers the importance of compassion and persistence, the need to follow every lead, and the value of seeing every victim as an individual whose story deserved to be told. The legacy of their work was measured not just in convictions, but in the ways they inspired others to serve with integrity and empathy. In the culture at large, the Bundy story became both a caution and a challenge, a reminder of what can happen when darkness goes unnoticed, but also a call to build stronger, more caring communities. Writers, artists, and filmmakers wrestled with how to tell the story honestly, refusing to look away from its horror, but also refusing to let it define the world by fear alone. The best work in this tradition found hope in the aftermath, hope in the resilience of survivors, the courage of families, and the slow, steady progress toward a more just society. Through it all, the names of the lost were kept alive, not just as victims, but as people who laughed, loved, and dreamed. Their friends and families told stories of everyday joys and small acts of kindness, preserving the truth that their lives were so much more than their final days. In this, there was both mourning and celebration, both grief and gratitude. The past could not be undone, but it could be honored, and in that honor there was strength. Decades after the events themselves, the Bundy case continued to shape the world it left behind. Every generation that heard the story was challenged to learn, to care, and to look out for one another. The fear that had once shadowed so many lives gave way, in time, to a determination not to be defined by tragedy. Through laws changed, lives rebuilt, and memories cherished, the story became not just a warning, but a testament to all the ways people can come together, heal, and move forward. In the end, the lasting lesson was not about the man at the center of the story, but about the communities who refused to let violence have the final word. The world was changed, yes, but it was also made stronger by the love that survived and the hope that, even in the darkest nights, there is always the possibility of mourning. The passing of time did not diminish the lessons learned in the wake of Ted Bundy's crimes. If anything, the echoes grew stronger, the story finding new meaning in each generation. The world had changed, but not just because of the darkness it once endured. It changed because, in the aftermath, people chose to build something better, to look for ways to protect and support each other, to lift up the stories of the lost and the lessons learned. Perhaps nowhere was this more visible than in the world of victim advocacy. In the years after Bundy's case, a movement took root, quietly at first, then growing with every story shared, every voice raised. Families who had endured unimaginable loss became some of the most powerful advocates for change. They spoke out at town halls and school assemblies, they worked with legislators to strengthen laws and improve investigations, and they founded organizations to support those who, like them, faced the hardest days. Out of sorrow grew a sense of purpose. People who had once felt powerless in the face of tragedy became the leaders of efforts to change the future. This movement gave rise to new systems of support. Victim hotlines, counseling centers, and advocacy groups emerged across the country, offering comfort and practical help in the wake of crime. Victim impact statements became a regular part of criminal proceedings, giving families the chance to speak in court, to say the things that had so long gone unspoken. The law itself changed, too, as more states enacted victims' rights legislation, ensuring that the needs and voices of those most affected were no longer overlooked in the rush of the legal process. Bundy's story also left a mark on law enforcement, driving innovation and collaboration. The days when investigators worked in isolation, when information was lost in the cracks between states and jurisdictions, gave way to a new spirit of cooperation. Shared databases, joint task forces, and multi-agency protocols became standard practice. Investigators learned to recognize patterns, to listen for details that might once have been missed, and to trust the instincts of survivors and families. These changes did not just help solve crimes, they helped prevent them, making communities everywhere a little safer. Technology, too, became an ally. In the decades that followed, advances in forensic science gave investigators new tools. DNA analysis, digital records, and national fingerprint databases transformed what was possible. Cold cases that had lingered in silence for years were reopened, and in some, long-awaited answers were finally found. Families who had once waited by the phone for news now received calls telling them that a piece of evidence, preserved for decades, had at last spoken the truth. Each breakthrough was both a triumph and a reminder. The work of remembrance was never wasted, and the hope of justice could endure. Beyond the legal and scientific changes, the greatest impact of all might have been in the way people looked out for each other. The Bundy case became part of a shared vocabulary, a reason to talk with children about safety, to check on friends who were walking home late, to listen when someone spoke of fear or intuition. The story was not used to frighten, but to remind. Communities became more connected, more willing to help, more attentive to the small details that can make all the difference. Out of tragedy grew a deeper sense of care. The story also changed the world of education. On college campuses and in high schools, classes on self-defense and personal safety became part of the curriculum. Student organizations devoted themselves to advocacy and support, creating networks that could respond quickly in times of crisis. Campus police officers worked more closely with students, and parents felt reassured by new measures designed to protect the next generation. The lessons of the past became the foundations of a safer future. For those who had lived through the events, the process of healing was ongoing. Families and survivors became mentors to others facing loss, their compassion born not of theory but of experience. They organized support groups, built online forums, and wrote books and articles that reached people far beyond their own communities. Some traveled the country to speak about their journey, encouraging others to seek help, to remember, to never give up hope. Their stories, honest, difficult, and filled with moments of courage, became a map for others walking similar roads. Through all of this, the names and faces of the victims were at the center. Year after year, vigils were held, memorial scholarships awarded, and gardens planted in their honor. On anniversaries, families gathered to share stories and laughter, to celebrate birthdays, graduations, and weddings that would never come. In these acts of remembrance, there was sorrow, but there was also joy, a determination that the lives lost would be defined not by their ending, but by the love and possibility they had brought into the world. The media, too, continued to evolve, learning from the past. Reporters became more sensitive in their coverage, focusing on the dignity of those affected, questioning the impulse to glorify perpetrators, and inviting the public to reflect on the deeper meanings behind each story. Documentaries and books increasingly gave voice to the victims, their families, and the investigators who worked tirelessly for answers. The story, once dominated by a single name, was now told through many voices, each one adding to the tapestry of memory and meaning. As time moved on, new generations encountered Bundy's story not as a distant myth, but as a reminder of the importance of care, vigilance, and empathy. Teachers spoke of the lessons learned, parents shared wisdom and caution, and communities found ways to carry hope forward. For many, the story was no longer just about loss, but about the power of love, the ways in which, even in the face of darkness, people can choose to look out for one another and to keep the memories of those lost alive. The aftermath of Bundy's crimes was not simply a period of mourning, but a journey of rebuilding. The world that emerged was one more aware of its vulnerabilities, but also more committed to protecting the vulnerable. The lines between tragedy and triumph, between loss and hope, were never clear-cut, but in every moment of remembrance, there was the quiet assurance that the darkness would not have the last word. In the end, the greatest legacy of all was the resilience of those left behind, their willingness to transform grief into action, to reach out in support, and to honor the past by building a safer and more compassionate future. Their voices, gentle but determined, became the true center of the story, guiding others through hardship and reminding the world that even the deepest wounds can, with care and courage, begin to heal. The story of Ted Bundy, for all its darkness and pain, ultimately became something more than a cautionary tale or a collection of headlines. As the years slipped by and the sharpness of fear dulled, what remained was not the legacy of a single man, but the enduring memory of those who were lost and the quiet, persistent hope of those who survived. In the slow return to ordinary life, communities and families learned that healing was neither simple nor complete, but it was real, and it was possible. In the decades after Bundy's death, the country moved on, but never truly forgot. Each anniversary, each news segment, each new documentary or book brought the story back into focus, if only for a moment. Yet the conversation had changed. Where once the details of Bundy's life and crimes dominated the narrative, over time, it was the lives of his victims and the voices of their loved ones that became central. Remembrance grew gentler, more private, and more profound, a series of quiet acts, a candle in a window, a whispered name, a promise kept. For many families, the rituals of memory became as important as any verdict or law. They gathered each year, sometimes in churches or community centers, sometimes at the sites where trees were planted or benches dedicated in the names of the lost. These moments of gathering were filled with stories, childhood memories, shared jokes, the dreams that once filled the future with possibility. There was always sorrow, but also a sense of gratitude for the love that had existed, for the time they had together, however short. In these moments, loss was transformed from something overwhelming and isolating into something shared and understood. Survivors, too, found meaning and purpose in the years that followed. Some became advocates, speaking at schools and conferences, helping others who had endured their own trauma. Others lived their lives quietly, choosing healing in the shape of small joys, friendships, careers, new families. The act of moving forward, of building a future after unimaginable pain, became its own form of remembrance. In their resilience, survivors offered hope to those who would face hardship in the years ahead, a living reminder that healing, while never easy, is always possible. Communities also found ways to mark the passage of time. On campuses once shadowed by fear, students and faculty worked to create safer, more welcoming spaces. Candlelight vigils, walks for awareness, and memorial scholarships became traditions, connecting generations and reminding everyone that the lessons of the past must be carried forward. Neighbors who had once locked doors in fear now looked out for one another with a renewed sense of responsibility. In small towns and big cities, the value of kindness and vigilance was quietly reinforced in 1,000 daily acts. The work of law enforcement, too, was changed forever. Detectives and officers who had spent years pursuing justice for Bundy's victims dedicated themselves to new cases, to training, and to advocacy. The lessons learned about cooperation, about believing survivors, about the power of forensic science and careful investigation, became part of the foundation for new generations of investigators. The commitment to justice endured, not just in policy, but in the hearts of those who knew the cost of getting it wrong. For the broader world, Bundy's story became a touchstone for conversations about evil, about safety, about the importance of community. It was a difficult story to tell, one that required honesty about what had been lost, but also hope in what could still be built. Writers and filmmakers returned again and again to the case, searching for new angles, new lessons, new ways to honor those at the center of it all. Over time, the focus shifted, as audiences became more thoughtful about the meaning behind the headlines, and more determined to center the dignity and humanity of those most affected. The story also became a quiet reminder of the power of ordinary goodness. For every act of violence, there were hundreds of acts of love, friends comforting friends, teachers watching over students, neighbors organizing searches, strangers sending letters of support. These moments did not undo the harm, but they stood in gentle defiance of it. The world, for all its flaws, proved again and again that compassion and connection endure, even when fear and sorrow threatened to overwhelm them. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was in the changed lives of those who remained. Some found their purpose in advocacy, others in family, still others in the simple act of living fully. In telling their stories, in refusing to be defined only by loss, they became the quiet heroes of a new chapter. They taught others to listen, to believe, and to act with care. They turned remembrance into action, and sorrow into strength. And so, in the end, the story of Ted Bundy became much more than a chronicle of crimes. It became a story of survival, of lives cherished, of families held together by memory and love, of communities rebuilt in the shadow of tragedy. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope can persist, and that healing, while never absolute, is always a choice to be made and remade, day by day. For anyone who carries the memory of loss, for anyone who has lived through the long night of fear and grief, there is comfort in knowing that the world goes on, not unchanged, but shaped by the lessons learned, the bonds strengthened, and the love that endures. Remembrance is never about holding on to pain, but about honoring the past in ways that allow for growth and new beginnings. The candles flicker. The names are spoken. Stories are told, and tears are shared. But always, there is a sense that what matters most is not the evil that once passed through, but the light that was kindled in response. In that light, the lost are never truly gone. In that light, every act of kindness, every word of hope, becomes a legacy that outlasts even the longest night. As time goes on, the world continues to learn, to care, and to remember. The story of Bundy's victims, their lives, their dreams, their courage, remains a quiet force for good, woven into the hearts of all who choose to remember with compassion. It is there, in the everyday acts of love and vigilance, that true survival is found. It is there, in the gentle insistence that every life is precious, that hope endures. And so, as this story comes to a close, what lingers is not fear, but gratitude, for the resilience of survivors, for the love of families, for the steady light of remembrance. The past cannot be changed, but it can be honored. The future cannot be predicted, but it can be shaped. And always, in every telling, there's the chance to build something better, a world where the lost are never forgotten, and where hope, quietly, persists.